millions of people around the world spot a three-pointed star on the roads, the emblem of one of the most prestigious and recognizable brands on the planet, Mercedes-Benz. For many, it is a symbol of luxury, wealth, and success. That star graces the cars of heads of state and movie stars. It gleams in advertisements and on the hoods of the world's most expensive automobiles. But few people know that at the origins of this legend stands not a child of fortune, but a poor boy who lost his father early and grew up in want. And fewer still suspect that the very name Mercedes belonged to a little girl, and that a decisive role in the birth of the automobile was played by a courageous woman whose name long remained in the shadows. Today we tell the true story of how a penniless boy gave the world the automobile. Great things are born in the last places you would expect them, and how behind the most dazzling symbols of success there sometimes stand the humblest and hardest of beginnings. The story begins on the 25th of November, 1844, in a small town near the German city of Karlsruhe, where a boy named Karl Benz was born into the family of a simple locomotive engineer. When Karl was barely 2 years old, his father caught cold at work and died, leaving the family without a breadwinner. The boy never knew a father's care and grew up with no memory of his face, and that early loss left its mark on his entire life. His mother was left alone with a small child and almost no means of support. But this courageous woman resolved, whatever the cost, to give her son a good education, denying herself virtually everything. She worked without rest, saved on every expense, and poured her last pennies into Karl's schooling, believing that only knowledge could lift him out of poverty. That quiet, maternal sacrifice became the very foundation upon which an entire automotive empire would later rise, for without her determination, the boy might have remained an unknown pauper all his days. Karl carried a deep gratitude to his mother throughout his life, and often recalled how much he owed her. And the boy did not let her down. From earliest childhood he was thoughtful and curious, and more than anything in the world, he was captivated by how things worked, and whether they could be made to work even better. Poverty did not embitter him. On the contrary, it hardened him, teaching him persistence and the ability to make do with little, and he would carry those qualities through every chapter of his life. From boyhood, he was drawn to machines and mechanisms as if by a magnet. He would spend hours gazing at locomotives, repairing clocks and instruments, crafting things with his own hands, and in his restless mind, bold dreams were already taking shape, dreams of machines that did not yet exist anywhere in the world. Thanks to his mother's sacrifices, Karl managed to enroll at the Polytechnic in Karlsruhe at quite a young age, and he threw himself into science and engineering with complete devotion. He proved to be a gifted and diligent student who grasped everything quickly, and his teachers predicted a bright future for him in the engineering profession. It was during these years that a dream was born in him, audacious for the times, to create a carriage that would move on its own, without any horse at all. In an era when all transport depended on horses, such an idea seemed almost mad. People laughed at him, for why would anyone dream up something new when the horse had faithfully served mankind for thousands of years? But Karl was firmly convinced that the future belonged to the machine, and that thought gave him no rest by day or night. He studied engines, gases, and mechanics voraciously, anything that might bring him closer to his cherished goal, and from total collapse. Without those funds, Karl simply could not have continued his experiments, and the automobile might never have come into being at all. Bertha was intelligent, bold, and decisive. She understood both engineering and business, and her faith and support repeatedly helped a dispirited Karl rise again and carry on with his work. It is said that she not only provided money and moral encouragement, but also delved into the technical side herself, discussing blueprints with her husband and noting their shortcomings. In an era when a woman's role was confined to running the household, she was a true co-author of the great invention, and that makes her figure all the more extraordinary. So two people stood at the cradle of the automobile, and the role of this remarkable woman in our story is far from over. And then, after long years of stubborn labor, trials, and failures, Karl Benz had his breakthrough. He managed to build a reliable internal combustion engine and mount it on a light, three-wheeled carriage. It took years of painstaking work, for the task was not merely to devise an engine, but to make it run reliably and for extended periods, adding ignition, cooling, and the transmission of power to the wheels. And each of those challenges Carl solved, in essence, for the first time in history. This was the world's first true automobile, the celebrated patent Motorwagen. On the 29th of January 1886, Carl Benz received a patent for his invention, and that day is recognized throughout the world as the birthday of the automobile. That unassuming-looking document proved to be genuinely historic, for it secured for humanity an entirely new way of moving across the earth. Decades would pass, and the descendants of that modest three-wheeled carriage would fill every road on the planet, transforming cities, distances, and the very fabric of everyday life. Just think about it. A poor boy, raised without a father and in perpetual want, created with his own hands a machine that was destined to change the face of the entire world forever. It was not merely a carriage, it was the beginning settled. Carl Benz had opened a door to the future, though he himself did not yet fully grasp how immense what he had created would turn out to be. It seemed as though success and fame should now have descended upon the inventor of their own accord. But that is not what happened at all. And here a second misconception lies in wait for us: the notion that a brilliant invention is immediately greeted with triumph. In reality, the opposite was entirely true. The world proved completely unprepared for the arrival of a self-propelled carriage. Many people simply laughed at the strange, clattering machine, calling it a noisy, dangerous, and ridiculous toy. Horses on the streets shied away from the unseen monster, and respectable townspeople gave it a wide berth. Sales were almost non-existent, for no one could understand why this curiosity was needed at all, when there were perfectly reliable horses. Carl Benz himself was by nature a modest, reserved, and self-doubting man, and such a cold reception crushed his spirits completely. For him, an engineer to his very core, it was far easier to tinker with blueprints and engines than to persuade a skeptical public and sing the praises of his own creation. The inventor began to doubt his own brainchild. His enterprise was once again on the verge of collapse, and the brilliant invention risked sinking into obscurity without ever reaching the people. The first public rides sometimes ended in outright embarrassment, as the machine would stall or frighten passers-by, and the hapless inventor was mocked. Officials viewed the novelty with suspicion, and cautious townspeople tapped their temples, dismissing the whole affair as an empty and dangerous amusement. It seemed as though the whole world had conspired against the stubborn dreamer from Mannheim. What was needed was some desperate, decisive act that would prove to the world that the automobile was not a toy, but the future. And it was Bertha who found the courage to take that act. What Bertha Benz did on an August morning in 1888 has rightly entered history and become the heart of this entire legend. Without saying a word to her husband and taking her two sons with her, she slipped out of the workshop in the early morning, quietly took the automobile, and set off on a long journey to visit her mother, a good 100 kilometers away. Bertha understood perfectly well that words and persuasion would no longer do, and what was needed was a deed that would speak louder than any speech. She believed in her husband's invention with all her heart, and decided to prove its worth to the world herself, in action, even at the cost of considerable risk. It was the first long-distance automobile journey in history, and it was made by a woman. The road was full of obstacles, but Bertha's resourcefulness knew no limits. When the fuel pipe became clogged, she cleaned it out with her hatpin. When a wire wore bare and began to spark, she insulated it with a garter from her stocking. And when the wooden brakes began to fail on the downhill stretches, she had a cobbler in a roadside village nail leather pads onto them, in effect inventing the world's first brake pads on the spot. Every breakdown that would stump many a driver today, this resolute woman fixed with remarkable ingenuity, using whatever was at hand. She bought fuel for the machine at a pharmacy, where the necessary solvent was sold, and that pharmacy entered history as the world's very first filling station. And all of this in a time when roads as we know them barely existed, when there were no filling stations, no repair shops, and no spare parts. Bertha and her sons drove into the complete unknown, along dusty country tracks and steep hillsides, not knowing what awaited them around the next bend, solving every problem themselves as it arose. It was a true pioneer's journey, and it was made by a woman with 2 sons on a fragile machine that had never been properly tested by anyone. By evening, Bertha and her sons had safely reached their destination and sent her husband a telegram announcing her triumph. One can only imagine what Carl felt upon learning that his wife and children had driven across half the country without him in a machine the whole world had written off as a useless toy. Anxiety for his family must have mingled in his heart with pride and relief, for what Bertha had done surpassed his most daring hopes. That bold journey caused an extraordinary sensation and proved to the world what years of persuasion had failed to prove. The automobile was reliable. It could cover great distances and was fit for real life, not merely for brief trials in the workshop yard. Newspapers took up the story. Genuine interest in Benz's car was finally kindled, and orders gradually began to come in. People suddenly saw in the automobile not a frightening curiosity, but a practical and dependable means of transport capable of taking them wherever they wished. What Carl had spent years unable to achieve through argument and demonstration, his wife accomplished in a single day filled with risk and resolution. In effect, it was that courageous woman at the wheel who saved both the automobile and her husband's entire enterprise from oblivion. That is why it is so unjust to remember only Carl's name, for without Bertha Benz's intelligence, boldness, and faith, the story of the automobile might have ended before it had properly begun. The journey not only rescued the family business, but also showed Carl what needed improving in the machine, and the next models became more reliable still. And so, before everyone's eyes, the laughed-at curiosity was becoming a desirable and useful thing, and more people wanted to possess this marvel of technology. The workshop, which had so recently stood on the brink of ruin, could now barely keep up with the orders. From there, things moved steadily upward. Orders grew, the Benz firm expanded, and by the turn of the new century, it had become the largest automobile manufacturer in the entire world. The dream of the penniless boy had come true in the most astonishing fashion. The man who had so recently been an object of ridicule now stood at the head of a thriving enterprise, and his cars were finding buyers ever farther afield. The poverty that had hounded him since birth was at last far behind. But the story of Mercedes-Benz would be incomplete without one more figure, and here a third misconception awaits us: the belief that Carl Benz was the only person who created the automobile. In fact, roughly 100 kilometers from Mannheim, at almost exactly the same time, another German inventor, Gottlieb Daimler, together with his gifted collaborator Wilhelm Maybach, was also working on high-speed petrol engines and his own self-propelled vehicles. Where Benz had from the very start conceived of an integrated automobile, Daimler and Maybach excelled above all at creating light and powerful engines that could be fitted to almost anything, from carriages to boats. Both approaches together laid the foundation for all future automotive engineering. The two greatest pioneers of the automobile labored side by side, in the same country and during the same years. Yet, astonishingly, by all accounts, they never once met in person, each pursuing the same goal by his own path, as rivals rather than allies. This is another widespread misconception, that Daimler and Benz were partners from the start and invented the automobile together. In reality, each arrived at his invention entirely independently, and for many years their firms competed fiercely for customers, never suspecting that one day their fates would merge into a single, celebrated name. Now is the time to reveal perhaps the most intriguing secret of all, where that resonant name, Mercedes, actually came from, and to dispel the notion that it was the name of some great automotive engineer. Nothing of the sort. Daimler's firm had a wealthy and influential admirer and sales agent by the name of Emil Jelinek, a passionate devotee of fast driving and automobile racing. He was not merely a customer, but a genuine engine of sales.
Find your perfect stay in just a few taps on Booking.com. Choose the filters that matter to you.
Promoting Daimler's cars among well-heeled society, and racing them himself under his daughter's name. At the very start of the new century, he commissioned a new, powerful, and fast automobile from Daimler, and stipulated that the model be named after his little daughter, whose name was Mercedes. The car turned out magnificently and was such a success that the melodious name Mercedes quickly caught on and soon became the name for all of Daimler's automobiles. And so it came to pass that one of the most famous brands in the world bears the name of a little girl who had nothing whatsoever to do with engineering. A name given out of a father's love has remained forever on the hoods of millions of cars across the globe. It turns out that one of the most expensive and prestigious names in the world is, at heart, simply an affectionate girl's name, and there is a touching irony in that. Emil Jelinek himself became so convinced of the brand's success that he eventually made it official, adding his daughter's name to his own surname. And young Mercedes, who gave her name to the legendary automobiles, could hardly have imagined that her childhood name would be spoken with reverence in every corner of the earth a full century later. And so the two great companies, the creation of poor Karl Benz and the enterprise of Gottlieb Daimler, went their separate ways for many years, competing with each other. But history decreed that they were destined, in the end, to merge into one. After a devastating war, Germany found itself in the deepest economic crisis. Money was losing its value at a terrifying pace, and selling expensive automobiles was becoming ever harder. Entire fortunes were turning to dust in a matter of days, factories stood idle, and buyers for luxury cars had nearly vanished. In such harsh conditions, it made far more sense for the two former rivals to join forces than to fight for survival alone. And in 1926, the two firms finally merged into one, forming the company that gave the world the legendary Mercedes-Benz brand. In that single name, the legacies of Benz and Daimler were united forever. Two men who were never together in life, but whose life's work became intertwined after it. Their old rivalry had turned into a partnership that proved far stronger than either of them had been alone. On the emblem of the new mark, Daimler's three-pointed star, symbolizing the dream of mastering land, water, and air, was framed by Benz's laurel wreath. And so, in a single badge, the audacious dream of conquering all the elements was joined with the ancient symbol of victory and glory. From that moment on, the three-pointed star became perhaps one of the most recognizable signs on Earth, instantly understood in any country and in any language. Two roads that had begun apart merged into one brilliant highway. By joining forces, the two celebrated firms united their rich experience and their finest minds, and that made the new company truly formidable. What had begun as a desperate bid for survival in hard times gave birth to one of the greatest brands in history, one destined to set the tone for the entire automotive world for decades to come. Karl Benz was fortunate enough to live to see that solemn day, and to witness how his once mocked invention had grown into an enormous global industry, and how his name had entered forever into the title of a great company. The poor fatherless boy, who had grown up in want and endured mockery, was, in the last years of his life, surrounded by honor and fame as the father of the automobile, the man who had changed forever the way all of humanity moves from place to place. He passed away on the 4th of April, 1929, having lived a long life and seen the fruits of his perseverance ripen. By that time, he was revered throughout the world as one of the greatest inventors, a man whose name is inscribed in human history alongside other great pioneers. And yet, it had all begun with a poor, unknown boy who had nothing but a dream and a stubborn refusal to give up. From a destitute boy repairing clocks by candlelight to the creator of a machine that conquered the world, his path became one of the most inspiring stories in the history of technology. By the end of his life, Karl Benz had already seen a good many automobiles on the roads, and every one of them was a distant descendant of that same three-wheeled carriage he had built in defiance of poverty and ridicule. He had witnessed the very beginning of the age he himself had opened,